My name is Thomas Layton, and I was a specialist 4th class in the 25th Infantry Division during the Vietnam War in 1969. I turned 20 the year I got deployed, but back then I still felt like a kid. It was December when I first set foot in Vietnam, just weeks after basic training. They shipped us out to Tay Ninh province, near the Cambodian border, where we were tasked with securing a region known for heavy Viet Cong activity. Our division operated out of a place we called Firebase Tiger, a cluster of makeshift bunkers, sandbags, and concertina wire surrounded by dense jungle. It wasn't much, but it was home, or as close to it as we could get in a place like that. The days were long and humid, and the nights were filled with the sounds of the jungle, crickets, birds, and sometimes the distant pop of gunfire. Most of us learned pretty quickly to sleep through it. My squad was tight-knit, made up of a mix of new guys like me and seasoned veterans who'd seen their fair share of action. There was Carter, a Texan who always chewed tobacco, and Daniels, a quiet guy from Ohio who carried a photo of his wife everywhere he went. Then there was Sergeant Murphy, our squad leader, who had been in country for almost a year and seemed to know every trick in the book. He was the kind of guy who didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. Our first big mission came in January, during what the brass called a reconnaissance in force. Basically, we were sent out to locate and engage enemy forces, pushing them out of the area. We knew the Viet Cong had been using the jungle near Firebase Tiger to stage attacks, and our job was to put a stop to it. It sounded simple enough on paper, but anyone who's been there will tell you that nothing in Vietnam was ever simple. We moved out early in the morning, the jungle still wrapped in mist. I was carrying an M16, just like most of the guys, along with my standard issue gear. It didn't take long before we were sweating through our fatigues. The air was so thick it felt like you could chew it, and the weight of the ammo and gear didn't help. We were spread out in a single file with Murphy at the front and me somewhere near the middle. The jungle was a whole other world. The trees were so tall they blocked out most of the sunlight, and the underbrush was so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt like a risk, like the ground might give way, or you'd trip a wire you didn't see. We moved slow, real slow, stopping every so often to listen. By midday, we hadn't seen anything but jungle and more jungle. No sign of the enemy, no sign of villages, nothing. Just as we were starting to think the mission might be a bust, Murphy held up his hand, signaling us to stop. I remember the way he looked, his head tilted, listening to something the rest of US couldn't hear. Then he pointed to the ground. At first, I didn't see it, but then it hit me. Tracks. They were faint, but they were there, boot prints, not ours, leading deeper into the jungle. It was enough to put everyone on edge. Murphy motioned for us to follow, and we did, our eyes scanning the trees and the ground, our fingers tight on the triggers of our rifles. The tracks led us to a small clearing. In the middle of it was what looked like an old, abandoned shack made of bamboo and palm leaves. It didn't look like much, but Murphy was cautious. He had us fan out around it, staying low and quiet. Daniels and I were on one side, Carter and Murphy on the other. That's when we saw it, a tripwire, barely visible in the shadows. It was strung low right in front of the shack. If we hadn't been paying attention, one of us would have walked right into it. Murphy waved us back, his face pale but focused. He signaled for Daniels to disarm it. Daniels was the closest thing we had to an explosives expert, though even he admitted he wasn't exactly trained for this kind of thing. I watched as he knelt down, his hands steady, but his face slick with sweat. The rest of us kept watch, our eyes darting between the jungle and the shack. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, Daniels gave us a thumbs up, and we exhaled as one. The wire was disarmed, but the fact that it was there at all meant we weren't alone. Murphy decided we needed to check out the shack, so he and Carter went in first, rifles up. I stayed outside with the others, scanning the trees for movement. After a few tense moments, Murphy called us in. Inside, we found a small stash of supplies. Ammo, rice, and medical kits, all in worn-out crates marked with faded Soviet writing. It was clear the Viet Cong had been using the shack as a supply point, but what got me was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable blood. In the corner, half hidden under a pile of rags, was a body. It was an enemy soldier, or what was left of him. His uniform was torn, and his chest was riddled with bullet holes. Judging by the look of him, He hadn't been dead long. Murphy didn't say much, just told us to take what we could carry and leave the rest. We moved fast, our nerves on edge. By the time we left the clearing, it felt like the jungle was closing in around us. It wasn't until later that night, back at Firebase Tiger, that we realized just how close we'd come to an ambush. The supplies we found weren't just abandoned, they were bait. The morning after we found that shack, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Murphy was on edge, pacing around our small camp just outside the firebase. He'd been up most of the night talking to the higher-ups on the radio, and whatever he heard must not have been good. We all had a bad feeling about what was coming next. By dawn, we got our orders. Push further into the jungle, follow the tracks we'd found, and locate any enemy positions. It didn't take a genius to figure out we were walking into something bigger than we could handle. Murphy didn't say it outright, but his face gave it away. We moved out just after sunrise, the jungle still damp with morning dew. I remember how quiet it was, like the whole world was holding its breath. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. Daniels whispered to me that he had a bad feeling about the whole thing, and I nodded because I felt the same way. The tracks from the day before were still there, fresher now, leading us deeper into the jungle. The deeper we went, the more the jungle seemed to close in around us. The trees were so thick overhead that it felt like we were walking through a green tunnel. After a few hours, Murphy called us to a stop. He didn't have to explain why. Up ahead, we could see something glinting in the sunlight, a claymore mine, half hidden in the underbrush. It was angled just right to hit anyone walking down the path. Murphy motioned for Daniels again. The guy was already sweating bullets, but he didn't argue. He dropped to his knees and started working on the mine, his hands moving slow and careful. The rest of us spread out, keeping watch. I was posted about 10 feet away, scanning the trees with my rifle. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement, just for a second, maybe 50 yards out. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It could have been an animal, but something told me it wasn't. I turned to signal Murphy, but before I could, all hell broke loose. The first shots came from our left, automatic fire ripping through the jungle. It was so loud and so sudden that I didn't even think to hit the ground right away. I just stood there, frozen, until Murphy screamed at us to spread out. We dove for cover, bullets kicking up dirt and leaves all around us. I could hear Carter cursing somewhere behind me, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. I tried to return fire, but I couldn't see where the shots were coming from. The jungle was too dense, the enemy too well hidden. Daniels had managed to disarm the claymore, but he was stuck in the open, pinned down by the enemy fire. I could see him lying flat on his stomach, his face pressed into the dirt. Murphy was shouting something at him, but it was impossible to hear over the chaos. That's when I saw Murphy make a break for it, sprinting toward Daniels with his rifle up. He fired a few shots into the trees, then grabbed Daniels by the back of his gear and dragged him to cover. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The guy had nerves of steel. We managed to hold our position, but the firefight felt like it went on forever. The enemy was using the jungle to their advantage, firing from positions we couldn't pinpoint. We could hear them shouting to each other in Vietnamese, their voices echoing through the trees. At one point, Carter took a hit in the leg. He went down hard, screaming in pain, but he kept firing, refusing to let up. Murphy crawled over to him, ripping a piece of cloth from his own shirt to tie off the wound. I don't know how long we were pinned down, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Tom didn't seem to work the same way out there. Eventually, the enemy fire started to let up, and we took the chance to regroup. Murphy gave the order to fall back, and we didn't argue. We moved fast, sticking close together, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. By the time we made it back to the firebase, we were exhausted, drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. Later that night, after we'd patched up Carter and checked our gear, Murphy called us together. He didn't give us a big speech or anything like that. It wasn't his style. He just looked at each of us, one by one, and said, "We made it. That's all that matters." But I could tell he was shaken. We all were. That day had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the enemy wasn't just some distant threat. They were out there, waiting, watching, We found out later that the tracks we'd been following led straight to a Viet Cong supply route, part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The shack, the claymore, even the firefight, they were all part of a plan to lure us in, to wear us down. Looking back, I'm not sure how we made it out of there alive. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was Murphy's leadership, or maybe it was just sheer stubbornness. All I know is that I'll never forget the sound of those first shots, the way the jungle seemed to explode around us. And that was just the beginning. The next few days were tense, but quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. Back at Firebase Tiger, we spent most of our time repairing gear, cleaning weapons, and going over patrol routes. Carter was stuck in the medic tent with his leg wound, and he wasn't happy about it. Daniels was jittery, barely eating, and even Murphy seemed more withdrawn than usual. We knew the enemy was out there. The firefight had confirmed that. What we didn't know was when or where they'd strike next. On the third day, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the call came in. A recon team about a mile east of our position had gone dark. They were supposed to radio back every hour, but no one had heard from them in 3. Command was worried, and rightly so. They ordered our squad to head out and investigate. Murphy didn't like it. None of us did. Moving through the jungle at night was dangerous on a good day, but after what had happened earlier in the week, it felt like walking into a trap. Still, orders were orders. We packed up our gear, loaded extra magazines, and set out just as the last bit of daylight disappeared. The jungle at night was a whole different beast. Without the sun, it felt like the darkness had a weight to it, pressing down on you from all sides. Our only light came from the moon, filtering weakly through the canopy, and the occasional glow of a flashlight. We moved slow, stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The crunch of our boots, the rustle of our gear, the faint buzz of mosquitoes. I kept my finger on the trigger of my M16, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Murphy was at the front, leading us like always. Behind him was Daniels, then me, and then the rest of the squad. No one spoke. We all knew better than to break the silence. About an hour into the patrol, we came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a helmet, lying in the dirt just off the trail. It wasn't one of ours. It was North Vietnamese, the kind their regular army wore. Next to it was a rifle, an old AK-47 with a rusted barrel. Murphy signaled for us to stop. He crouched down, examining the helmet and rifle without touching them. After a moment, he looked back at us and motioned for us to spread out. Something wasn't right, and we all felt it. As we moved forward, the smell hit me first. It was faint at first, like rotting leaves, but the closer we got, the stronger it became. By the time we reached the clearing, it was almost overpowering. There, in the middle of the clearing were the recon team, or what was left of them. The bodies were sprawled out in the dirt, their uniforms torn, their weapons scattered. They'd been ambushed, cut down in seconds by the looks of it. But it wasn't just the gunfire that had killed them. Their throats had been slit, their gear looted. It was brutal, savage, and it turned my stomach. Murphy didn't say a word. He just motioned for us to spread out and secure the area. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his rifle, just a little tighter. Daniel stayed close to me, his face pale as a ghost. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. "Keep moving," I whispered back. We didn't find any sign of the enemy in the clearing, but the tracks told a different story. Boot prints, dozens of them, leading away from the scene and deeper into the jungle. It was clear the ambush had been recent, maybe an hour or two at most. Murphy made the call to follow the tracks. He didn't like it, and neither did we, but we couldn't just leave without trying to figure out where they'd gone. The trail led us to a small stream, its surface glinting in the moonlight. On the far side, we found more signs of movement, footprints, broken branches, even a discarded bandage. They were close. We crouched low, moving as quietly as we could. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Every shadow looked like a person, every rustle of leaves like a gunshot. And then we saw it, a small camp, hidden in a thicket of bamboo. There were maybe 10 of them sitting around a low fire. They were armed, but their rifles were propped against trees or slung over their shoulders. They were relaxed, laughing quietly, completely unaware of our presence. Murphy motioned for us to fan out, taking up positions around the camp. I found myself behind a fallen log, my rifle trained on the closest enemy soldier. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay still. The signal came quickly, a sharp wave from Murphy, and all hell broke loose. We opened fire, our rifles cracking through the night. The enemy scattered, scrambling for their weapons, but we had the upper hand. One by one, they went down, their shouts turning to screams, then silence. By the time it was over, the camp was in ruins. Smoke hung heavy in the air, and the ground was littered with bodies. I couldn't stop shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through me. Murphy ordered us to search the camp, and what we found sent a chill down my spine. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and maps. Maps of Firebase Tiger. They'd been planning something big. We burned the camp, destroyed the supplies, and headed back to the firebase before dawn. None of us said much on the way back. We were too tired, too shaken. When we finally made it back, Murphy reported everything to command. They praised us for the job we'd done, but none of us felt like celebrating. We'd stopped an attack, sure, but at what cost? Those recon boys never stood a chance. I remember lying in my bunk that morning, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of that clearing of those bodies was burned into my mind, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The days after the ambush on that camp felt like a blur. Command was on high alert, doubling patrols around Firebase Tiger and pulling in intelligence from every source they could find. We'd stopped one attack, but the supplies and maps we'd found hinted at something bigger, and nobody wanted to get caught flat-footed. For the squad, the tension was unbearable. Murphy tried to keep us focused, running drills and organizing gear, but it was clear the firefight had left its mark. Daniels was jumpier than ever, flinching at every loud noise. Carter, who was still recovering from his leg wound, refused to stay in the medic tent and hobbled around with his rifle, muttering that he wouldn't be caught sitting still if the Viet Cong came back. I wasn't much better. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing, the bodies of those recon boys, and the burning camp. I kept thinking about how close we'd come to missing it, how easy it would have been for those plans to go unnoticed. A week later, the hammer dropped. It was late afternoon, and the air was thick with heat. Most of us were lounging in the shade, trying to cool off and conserve energy. That's when we heard it, the low thump of mortars, followed by the distant crack of explosions. The first few hit outside the perimeter, shaking the ground and sending plumes of dirt into the air. Then they started getting closer. Murphy was shouting orders before the second round landed. To your positions, now! We scrambled for cover, grabbing our rifles and helmets, ducking behind sandbags and into bunkers. The sky was alive with chaos, mortar rounds bursting in flashes of light and sound. The air smelled like burning, a mix of dirt, smoke, and something metallic. As the mortars stopped, a new sound filled the air, the sharp, unmistakable crack of AK-47s. The Viet Cong were coming. They hit us from the north, pouring out of the jungle like shadows. There must have been at least 50 of them, moving fast and low, firing as they went. The first wave hit the wire, triggering claymores we'd set up weeks earlier. The explosions were deafening, sending shrapnel and bodies flying, but it barely slowed them down. I was in one of the forward bunkers with Daniels and another guy, Ramirez, firing at anything that moved. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The enemy kept coming, wave after wave, their shouts mingling with the roar of gunfire. We cut them down as fast as we could, but for every one that fell, it seemed like two more took their place. At one point, the fighting got so close that they were at the wire, climbing over it with nothing but machetes and raw determination. One of them made it to our bunker, throwing himself at the opening with a grenade in hand. Ramirez managed to shoot him before he could throw it, but the grenade went off anyway, sending a shower of dirt and shrapnel into the bunker. I felt something hot slash across my arm, and when I looked down, I saw blood soaking through my sleeve. Daniels was screaming, clutching his leg where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his thigh. Ramirez was already grabbing a bandage, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was no time to think. The enemy was still coming. Murphy was everywhere, barking orders, pulling wounded men to safety, and laying down fire with his M16. I don't know how he did it, but seeing him move like that kept the rest of us going. At some point during the chaos, Carter showed up, dragging his bad leg, but firing his rifle like a man possessed. He dropped into the bunker next to me, his face covered in dirt and sweat. "Thought you'd miss all the fun?" I shouted over the noise, half laughing despite the fear. "Hell no," he growled, firing off a few rounds. The fight raged on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Slowly, the enemy fire started to let up. The waves of attackers thinned, their shouts growing quieter. By the time the last of them retreated into the jungle, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in eerie twilight. When it was over, the silence was deafening. No gunfire, no shouting, just the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. The ground outside the wire was littered with bodies, both theirs and ours. The medics were already moving through the chaos, pulling survivors to safety and covering the dead with ponchos. Murphy called us together, what was left of us, and started taking stock. We'd lost 6 men, and another dozen were wounded, some badly. Ramirez was helping Daniels, who was pale and shaking but alive. Carter was sitting against a sandbag, clutching his leg but grinning like a madman. "We held," Murphy said quietly, his voice rough. "That's what matters." Later that night, as we sat in the bunker, too wired to sleep, Murphy told us the attack wasn't random. The Viet Cong had been trying to overrun Firebase Tiger for weeks, using intel from that supply route we disrupted. If we hadn't taken out that camp, they might have succeeded. That thought stuck with me. For all the blood, the chaos, and the loss, we'd made a difference. It didn't make it easier to sleep that night, but it was something. I didn't know it then, but that battle would stay with me for the rest of my life. The faces of the men I fought with, the sounds of the jungle, the weight of the rifle in my hands. They're as clear to me now as they were back then. And I'll never forget what Murphy said to us the next morning as we stood in the ruins of Firebase Tiger. "We survived. That's more than most can say." The morning after the attack, Firebase Tiger looked like it had been through hell and back. The perimeter was shredded, the bunkers were pockmarked with bullet holes, and the ground was scorched from mortar blasts. But we were still standing. We were alive, and that was something. Murphy didn't let us dwell on it for long. By sunrise, he had us working, repairing the wire, restocking the bunkers, and clearing the battlefield of anything that could be salvaged. It was grim work, pulling bodies out of the dirt, some of them so torn up they didn't even look human anymore. But it had to be done. I remember finding a kid, barely older than me, lying near the wire. He had an AK-47 slung over his shoulder and a pouch of grenades on his belt. His face was peaceful, like he was just taking a nap. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him. He couldn't have been more than 18. "Keep moving," Murphy said from behind me, his voice low. "There's more to do." By the time we finished, the sun was high in the sky, beating down on us like it was punishing us for surviving. We gathered in the center of the base, dirty, exhausted, and silent. No one said a word as the medics carried the last of the bodies to the evac chopper. Murphy stood in front of us, his face grim. He didn't give a speech. He wasn't the kind of guy who wasted words, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. We'd done our job, but the cost was written all over the base and burned into our minds. A few days later, we got orders to move out. Command wanted us to patrol the areas south of the firebase, where intelligence suggested the Viet Cong were regrouping. None of us were eager to head back into the jungle, but we didn't have a choice. We packed our gear, said our goodbyes to the guys staying behind, and headed out just before dawn. The jungle was still, almost too still, as if it was holding its breath. Murphy led the way, as always, with me and Daniels close behind. Carter was with us too, limping but refusing to sit this one out. "Can't let you guys have all the fun," he said with a smirk, though his eyes told a different story. The first day passed without incident. We found a few old campsites, some abandoned gear, but no sign of the enemy. The second day was the same. By the third day, we were starting to think the intel was wrong. That's when we stumbled across the tunnel. We were moving through a particularly dense section of jungle, the kind where the trees are so close together you can barely see a few feet ahead. Murphy stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. "What is it?" I whispered, stepping up beside him. He pointed to the ground. At first, I didn't see it, but then it clicked. A small patch of disturbed earth, almost invisible beneath the leaves. Murphy crouched down, brushing the leaves aside. Beneath them was a wooden trapdoor, half hidden by the undergrowth. We knew what it was before we even opened it. The Viet Cong were infamous for their tunnel networks, labyrinths of underground passages used to move troops, store supplies, and launch surprise attacks. Finding one was like stumbling across a hornet's nest. Murphy signaled for us to fan out, securing the area. Then he and I pried the door open, revealing a narrow shaft leading straight down into the darkness. The air coming out of it was stale and foul, like something had been rotting down there for months. "Guess we're going in," Daniels muttered, his voice shaking. Murphy nodded. "We'll go two at a time. Stay close, watch your step, and keep quiet." The tunnel was even worse than I'd imagined. It was cramped, barely wide enough to move through, and the air was so thick it felt like you were breathing through a wet rag. I was second in line behind Murphy, with Daniels and Carter bringing up the rear. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every sound echoed: the scuff of our boots, the clink of our gear, the drip of water somewhere in the distance. About 50 feet in, the tunnel split into two. Murphy paused, shining his light down each passage. "We'll take the left," he said quietly. "Stay close." We hadn't gone more than a few steps when the walls suddenly shook, and the air was filled with dust and debris. "Booby trap!" someone shouted behind me. The explosion was deafening, knocking me off my feet and slamming me into the wall. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing, couldn't see anything but darkness. When I came to, Murphy was pulling me to my feet. "You okay?" he asked, his voice muffled. I nodded, though my head was spinning. Behind me, Daniels was coughing, waving away the dust. Carter was on the ground, clutching his side where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his vest. "We need to move," Murphy said, his voice sharp. "They know we're here." The rest of the tunnel was a nightmare. We moved as fast as we could, navigating turns and dead ends, all the while expecting another trap. At one point, we stumbled across a storage room, crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. It was a jackpot, but we didn't have time to take much. Murphy set a charge, and we kept moving. We finally found an exit after what felt like hours. It was another trapdoor leading up into the jungle. We emerged into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. The air smelled fresh, clean, and it was the best thing I'd smelled in days. We didn't stop to rest. Murphy led us a safe distance away, then radioed the firebase to report what we'd found. The charges we'd planted went off not long after, collapsing the tunnel and taking whatever was left inside with it. As we watched the smoke rise into the sky, Murphy turned to us. "We did good," he said quietly. "Let's get back." That was one of the last missions I went on before leaving Vietnam. The jungle, the tunnels, the firefights, they're all still with me like scars that never really heal. But I'm proud of what we did. We made it through. And in the end, that's what matters.